We're on. Okay, good. Well, there we go, talking past each other. Right. Yeah, yeah. So good morning. So this is you might remember we've got two sermon series running intertwined today, which I was trying to explain to Joyce earlier, and we both got a bit confused, I think. So we've got the one about the prayers of the Bible, and we've also got this Reframe series about entering into the big story of Scripture and going through various kind of, I suppose, staging points in the story of Scripture and see what the big story is and how we might fit in it. So I did the first one, whenever it was, about 3 weeks ago. I can't even remember when the next one is. I think it might actually be next week. And then there might be another one coming in interspersed. But if you see this slide, you'll know we're on the Reframe series. So as I say, this is the series where we try and look at the whole biblical sweep and see how it affects every area of our lives. And I talked last time about how the idea of what God's work might be could be a little bit broader than the idea, certainly, that I grew up with. We talked about things like, why we do what we do on a day-to-day basis. For those of us who go to work, why we go to work. We talked about the traditional Christian views about we go to work to preach to our co-workers, or that we go to work because it refines our character. God works on us through our work. Or that it's simply a means of provision. It's a way of God giving us what we need on a day-to-day basis. And I think all of that is true to some extent. There'll be some truth in all of those things. But we probably don't need a sermon series on those because we get taught those all the time, or that's what we've got in our heads already. But what we want to do in this sermon series is try and work out whether the actual work that we do, our day-to-day work and labouring, whether there's a deeper and richer aspect to that. That God can work through. So as I say, this is the second preach in the series. You might be worried because I did the last one and therefore you're thinking I'm doing all of them. Don't worry. Luis was actually supposed to be doing this, but he's a bit tied up at the moment with, I think, Denmark next week and Spain the week after. So we've switched it around a little bit, but you'll hear from Luis in the November slot. So the other thing we talked about last time, you might have to move that for me, Nathan, if you don't mind, is that stories make sense of the world, and we need to understand our stories. So our story as Christians, the biblical story, the biblical narrative, which we fit into. And how we view that big story and how we fit into it influences what we do and what we think on a daily basis. And I think pretty much my favourite story ever really illustrates this point quite nicely. So it's a true story. There is no embellishment in this story whatsoever. Okay, so we're going back to 2001, and I'm at law school in Nottingham, and in a house share in a fairly grotty part of Nottingham, which anyone who's been a student will realise that's where you're required to live as a student. And I was living with three other guys. A guy who I grew up with, knew since I was, 2-3 years old, so it was really nice to spend time with him. A guy who was on my course, who I knew from university in London, and then a fourth guy, who I didn't know at all, actually. He was a friend of one of the others. And he was really only in Nottingham as an excuse to be with his girlfriend. He didn't really have any other reason to be there. He was doing a master's degree, but I don't think he was that bothered. He just needed a fig leaf to cover the fact that he was in Nottingham and spending time with his girlfriend. Now, the unfortunate thing for him and his girlfriend is that sadly they split up quite soon after he got to London. And he was very sad about this, as you can imagine, and obviously keen to help in every way that I could. I saw an advert in the newspaper for a high-class dating agency called Barclay Sweetingham International. And so I went onto their website, signed him up for the newsletter or something, and that was it. I heard nothing more for a year. I thought, he just got the thing in the post, ditched it, and it was just a bit of a joke. It turned out actually quite a lot had happened in that time, and he only told me a year later what the full story was. So apparently they sent him a brochure, and he got this brochure through the post, and as befits apparently a very high-class dating agency, it didn't actually say very much about what they did. It was very discreet. You don't want to, kind of remind people about their services, so it was very discreet. And it's fair to say that, as my flatmate told it later, unless you knew what their business was, you wouldn't really have worked it out from the brochure. It was that discreet and that indirect in the way that it was put together. Now, and here's the kicker, and I didn't know this at the time. My flatmate at the same time was applying to join the Secret Service. MI5, MI6. He wanted to be a spy, basically. So, he gets this brochure through from Barclay Sweetingham International, unsolicited. This is all completely true. Reads it and thinks, Secret Service aren't going to apply on Secret Service headed notepaper, are they? This must be them. So, apparently there's a phone number in there, and it says, if you'd like to take this further, please call now and make an appointment. So he said, right, okay, that's what I'm going to do. So he called up, made an appointment for a week or two later, and then said, all he told us at the time is that he was going down to London to visit family. He did have family in London, so that made sense. But turned out he wasn't going to visit family at all. He was going to the offices of Barclay Sweetingham International in West London. 5 Carlton Gardens, from what I remember. And so he turns up, and this is all him telling me the story later, of course. I didn't witness any of this. He turns up at reception at this very fine old building in West London and is met at reception by apparently a very attractive younger lady who looks a bit bemused when she sees him, this guy, 21, 22 years old. Anyway, takes him into one of their interview rooms and I guess just to ask some questions, to build his profile and do whatever these people do. So she opens up with a very standard opening question and says, so, Mr. X, why don't you just tell me a bit about yourself? My flatmate then launches into a long speech about how much he loves war and international relations and conflict resolution around the world. And after about apparently 5 minutes, this lady, now slightly bemused or increasingly bemused as she goes through, stops him and says, that's all very interesting, but what's it got to do with this? And at that point, he discovers he is not in an interview for the Secret Service. He is not going to be the next James Bond, but in fact, he is at a high-class dating agency which finds partners for very wealthy, busy, middle-aged men, which is why they're all the more bemused that this kind of attractive, fit, young 21, 22-year-old walks through and they just can't quite put it out. So as he tells me the story, he then he leaves this building, finds the nearest bench, sits down, and is just completely shell-shocked about what had just happened. And just to tidy up the story and put it in a neat bow and all the rest of it, the security service did reply to him, I think on Home Office headed notepaper, or Foreign Office headed notepaper, about a week later or 2 weeks later, and said, you're not British, so we can't give you a job. Which is true. He holds a passport from a different country. So now, apart from this being a remarkable and, as I say, utterly true story, I think it quite neatly encapsulates the importance of stories and where we fit within them. Now, my flatmate had his assumptions about what was going on, what the world looked like, and how he fitted into that particular world that he seemingly had created in his head by putting 2 and 2 together and getting about 459. And his failure to appreciate the true position of what was going on obviously had all kinds of knock-on consequences. And fundamentally, he wanted a particular version of events, or version of the world, to be true, and actually he excluded all evidence to the contrary. This was 2001. You could have Googled this in 2001 if you really wanted to get to the bottom of it. But he really wanted it to be true. This story was so strongly imbibed in his head. But what he really needed to do was understand the true story and then put himself within it. And that's obviously our task today. So, as we know from the reading, and thank you, Joyce, that was a long one. Today we are going back to the beginning. So if we could flick on to, that'd be great, Nathan. One more. Back to the beginning, the very beginning. So back to Genesis. And we spoke before about how the Bible is one big, long story. So it's got a beginning which explains why God set the whole thing up. It's got a middle where it records how God's people should live and in fact shouldn't live. There's lots of messing it up and then coming back and getting it right, and there's a whole flow of that to that story. And then there's an end which reveals a glorious future. And we're obviously in the middle of that story still. So taking that in order, it makes sense to start at the beginning, to start in Genesis. And in fact, the Hebrew name for the book of Genesis is in the beginning. And what they tend to do with Hebrew books is take the first few words and make that the title. So it's all about the beginning. And when we say Genesis, that comes from a Greek word that's for birth or origin. So it takes us back to the beginning as well. Now, one thing I should say today is there are obviously endless debates in Christian circles about how God made the world. And there are some people who take a very literal 7-day creationist view, and there are people who take very different views, and there's a whole different spectrum. I'm not going to get into that today. It's not relevant to what I'm talking about, because I'm not particularly concerned today about how God made the world. I want to know why and what our role is between it. Yeah, you're on board, Hart. But what I would say is, particularly after reading those verses, and if it comes up in conversation, there are lots of Christians who take different views on these things, and lots of them love Jesus very, very much. And so if they take a different view to you on those issues, please approach those conversations as brothers and sisters in Christ who are all trying to get to the heart of what God has for us. But as I say, that's not where we're pausing today. Who knows, it may come up in home group or something during the week. But today we're talking about we're talking about why, not how. So why did God create us? And what are we supposed to be doing? What's our purpose within all of that? And as I say, there are various parts of the Bible story that help us think about that. You can go to the next slide, sir. But today we're just going to be focusing on what Genesis, on these two chapters in Genesis, what they tell us. So, if we go to the next slide, what's going on in Genesis and what can we glean from this story, or these two chapters? And I think it's quite interesting to read them actually back to back, because sometimes we don't do that, and it's a bit weird, isn't it? Because you read chapter 1 and there's one Genesis story, creation story, and you read chapter 2 and there's another Genesis creation story. And trying to stick them together is not always particularly straightforward. So that's why it's quite interesting to read them back to back. Things happen in a slightly different order, seemingly. And also what some people say when they read Genesis 1 and 2 is they say, oh, hold on a second. And if you go to the next slide, some of this looks like other creation stories that people have read about from other ancient religions. So if we go to the next bit, this is a tablet from Babylon, thousands of years old. This is I can't read it, A, because I don't know the language, and B, because it's terrible quality. But this is the Enuma Elish. So this is a creation myth from the Babylonian era. And if we go to the next slide, there's another thing that they found on archaeological digs. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia. They also had a creation story. So there are other creation stories going around at the time. And some people say, well, hold on a second, there's some similarities we see between these various creation stories. What do we do with that? I'm not going to go into the similarities. I'm much more interested today in the differences between the creation stories and what it tells us uniquely about the God that we believe in and the creation story that we see in Genesis. So if you look in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian one, the world is created out of a war between the gods. That's how it comes to pass. It's the product of this war. Genesis knows nothing of that whatsoever. Genesis has a God who creates out of love. That's our backdrop. That's our story. We don't come out of war and disorder and violence. We come out of a God of love. That's as Christians, that's what our story is here. Other creation myths and stories talk about God's creating humans because, frankly, they don't want to do the work for themselves. So you've got gods who are can't be bothered to feed themselves anymore, so they get humans to come in and to offer sacrifices to the gods and create food and develop food for the gods. Does that sound like our God? No, our God provides for us, or finds ways of providing food through this good creation and through this good earth that he's given us. So he wants to provide for us rather than really wanting us to provide for him. He doesn't really need us in the way that these other gods need the humans that they've created. But what else do we see in this Genesis account? We see that the earth is not an accident. In some of these other creation accounts, the earth is an accident, accidentally coming out of war and the overflow of that. It's not random, and it's got order. That's what we see throughout these creation accounts, this idea of order. And planets don't need to have order. Our modern science tells us that. And unless anyone can correct me, I think we're still fairly safe in the idea that this is the only planet we are aware of anywhere in the universe that sustains life. And we haven't found anyone else who does that, and they haven't found us. So I think for now we can be fairly solid from that perspective that it is all about that God has created order, uniquely created order where we are, and we are living the benefits of that. He created order out of chaos. The other thing that we see through the Genesis account is that the world is separate to God. The world isn't divine. So, a lot of the old religions, and you'll see them written in the Old Testament, people used to worship the sun and the moon. Yeah, that was quite a common thing. What did we learn from Genesis? Just describes them as lights. Very deliberately, so it says these aren't God. These are just lights. These are creation. This is part of God's good creation to provide for us. And of course we need the sun, because otherwise nothing grows. Those kinds of things. So it's all part of God's goodness, but it isn't God. And although they're not God, and the created order and the world around us are not God, they are, to use a word, sacred, in the sense of worthy of respect, worthy of reverence, something that God has created which we need to look after. Not divine, but sacred. And this comes through, and I think this is really interesting, if you could just flick to the next slide, with some comparisons when people read through the Genesis account and they compare it to the temple and the tabernacle in the Old Testament. So what people used to do in the ancient Near East is they used to build temples which were designed to reflect what they saw as the structure of the cosmos and the earth. And so when you look at the Genesis account, it uses the word for light. I was just talking about the sun and moon and light, and that Hebrew word is meor. And that's exactly the same word that you see in Exodus 35:14 when it talks about the sanctuary light in the tabernacle. Exactly the same thing. In Genesis 2:2, it talks about God finishing his work. Compare that to Exodus 40:33 when Moses finishes the tabernacle. Exactly the same phrase again. Genesis refers in Genesis 1:9 to the sea. If you look in 1 Kings 7:23, 2 Chronicles 4:2, you'll see the sea in the temple again. All these parallels between the creation and the temple. If you look at the Garden of Eden in chapter 2, where was the entrance? Oh no, it's in 3, I think that's it. But where's the entrance to the Garden of Eden? It was on the east side. Where's the entrance to the temple in Jerusalem? It's on the east side. And it's this lovely image of how God's creation is similar to this idea of a temple, and that it's where God's presence comes to dwell. And do you know what they used to put in the temple? The last thing they used to put in the temple when they put together ancient Near Eastern temples, the very last thing that went in was the image of the God they were worshipping. And what do we see in Genesis 1 and 2? What's the last thing that's created and goes in? Humans. And it's described very specifically as in the image of God, he made them. So this lovely picture of this place deliberately that God has come to dwell, and that we are to be part of that. So what is our role in this story? What are we supposed to do? Now, next slide, please. So other religions and belief systems, as I say, didn't see humans as important at all. Their only job was to keep the gods happy. You were a slave for the gods. That's all you were there to do. And as I said before, Genesis doesn't share that view of the world at all. This God, our God, doesn't have needs that we need to satisfy. He's all right on his own, unlike some of the other ancient gods. So the world wasn't created for God in that sense. It wasn't because he needed it. But he did want to bless us and help us to fill the world. And he blesses us with food and those kinds of things and the ability to sustain life. And we're not here to look after the divine image in the temple. We are the divine image. We are in the image of God. We are created. And the really interesting thing, we'll look about this in a minute, is what we call to do in those two passages. Genesis 1 talks about us being kings, and Genesis 2 talks to us about being priests. Kings and priests, that's what we're supposed to be doing in all aspects of how we look after life and look after the creation that we're in. So, what do we see in Genesis? This ideal first setup, how God set up the world. Why did he make it this way, and how did he make it this way? If we go to the next slide, what we'll see is there are three relationships. So there's a relationship with God, relationship with other humans, and the relationship with the rest of creation. And what we see in Genesis is this unbroken communion with God. They walk in the garden with him, yeah, all the time. That's what it's described as, this unbroken communion with God. Unbroken communion with each other through this idea of people being naked. No, completely open and open relationships with one another. And then this relationship with the rest of creation. We'll look at it in a minute, but I'm not going to get into vegetarianism, but if you look at Genesis 1, there might be a shout for it. Unfortunately, I'm a very strong meat eater. But when all of these three things are right, our relationship with God, our relationship with other humans, and our relationship with the rest of creation, when that's all right, then that's when creation knows shalom. That's what Genesis is modeling for us. And shalom isn't just peace. Sometimes I think we've probably grown up with this idea again, for those who grew up in church, that shalom is just peace. It's not just peace, it's so much more than that. It's not just the absence of conflict. It's much further. It's this kind of feeling that all's right with the world. It's fullness of life, it's well-being, it's flourishing. And that's really what we're at. That's our job, is to get these relationships right so the world benefits and we benefit and we reflect that glory back to God, taking our gifts and offering them back to God in thanksgiving in this temple of creation. And in all of that, our work itself matters. When we're working towards these things, that's when our work matters and we can deliver harmony and shalom. So let's have a quick look at the passages, Nathan, on the next slide that I was just talking about. So Genesis 1 and 2, this idea of being kings and priests. So God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, and then rule over," and it goes over, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and all the rest of it. And then the stuff we're supposed to eat, it turns out, is every seed-bearing plant. There's nothing here actually about eating animals, but as I say, we won't dwell on that for now. But the bit I want to focus on for present purposes is the idea of be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, and then rule over. And we're going to look a little bit in a moment about what it means to rule over. And then on the other side of this, Genesis 2:15, so the second creation story, God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. So ruling over, working it, take care of it. Those are some themes that come through. So if we flick onto the next slide, I've put there the Hebrew word. So where it says rule over, or some translations say have dominion over, you might have seen elsewhere, that is the Hebrew word rada. Caregiving, nurturing, not exploiting. So it's not ruling over just to do whatever we like with it. That's not the purpose of the word. That's not what it's meant to mean. It's to do with looking after stuff, nurturing and not exploiting. And in the second bit we were looking at, Genesis 2, which talks about working and serving, the word is abad, another Hebrew word. And that's not just maintenance or preservation, but being part of God's creative process. The other interesting thing is the word abad is the same word that's used for Levitical service in the temple. So that idea of being a priest and serving and looking after comes back to this temple idea that I was talking about earlier. And I think, when I look at these things and I think about my everyday life and I think about my work, that when I get jaded and I feel a lack of sense of purpose, that actually coming back to these things and trying to think about, is what I'm doing fitting within these ideas, that's what starts to give me then a greater sense of, oh, hold on a second, there's something going on here, even if I can't immediately see the outcome. Is the way that I'm behaving, the way that I'm doing things, is it rada and is it abad in the way that I approach it. And I had one of those weeks this week where I was thinking now and again about, goodness, I feel a bit jaded about work and what's going on. So I thought, well, maybe I should try and jot some stuff down. How do I fit into this creation system that we're talking about here? How do I try and bring and restore order in what I do? I mentioned last time what it is that I do. I do a lot of disputes with, I suppose, amongst very wealthy dysfunctional families, you might describe them. But I try to bring and restore order. I try to help people resolve their disputes. I try to calm tensions rather than incite them. Even if they end up in court, at least they're on the path to a result. There's some measure of finality. Lots of my clients own significant businesses. We want those businesses to survive and thrive because they provide jobs and support to people. We don't want people to lose their jobs. I want to help people, both clients and people I work with, to think clearly about what it is they want and what's good. I want to look after the employees we have. I want to encourage them. I occasionally invite them around for barbecues because I want them to know that I value them as people, not just as units of production, and the people I can have relationships with. I train people to do their job well and hopefully in the right way, with integrity and honesty and gunning for the right results. We provide well-paid jobs for people. It's a form of provision. We work with people in advance, with clients, say, that might end up in a dispute. Let's deal with that problem now before it becomes a problem later. I try to encourage people to have difficult conversations, so you deal with the problem up front rather than wait for it to explode. I encourage people to have balance in their lives, particularly people who I work with. I try to promote family-friendly ways of working as one of the supporters of our family network at work. And I mentioned this last deliberately because some people put it first, I do pro bono work, so help charities do various bits and bobs. But I don't want to see that as the main thing. I want to emphasize the other things because they're day-to-day normal life stuff, and we don't always see them as part of our mandate and what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis of caregiving and nurturing, of serving, being part of this Levitical service process. Last time round, you might remember I asked Lola some questions about her job. This time round in advance, I asked Shidin some questions about his job, and your preference was that I read them out, so it's not that I'm excluding Shidin from this part of the service. So I asked him 4 questions. In the same 4 questions I asked Lola, and bringing all this together in, I suppose, a sense of vocation, and you'll get a very clear sense of vocation when I read out Shidin's answers to this. I thought they were fantastic. So the first question is, what do you spend your days doing? The majority of my day consists of speaking to people and learning about their concerns of the impact which their death would have on their family. So Shidin sells life insurance, I should say. I would then search the market for a suitable life insurance policy which would protect their family financially should the worst happen. Question 2, what do you enjoy about it? I'm passionate about my job because I believe life insurance is the most important purchase a person could make, since it could be life-changing for the loved ones they leave behind. I feel honoured to be on that journey with people from all walks of life, and leave work feeling great, knowing that I had a part to play in supporting a person's family in their greatest time of need. Question 3, what do you find challenging about it? Since life insurance is quite personal, you tend to build a connection with people, so I usually remember most of my clients well. Due to this, I find the claims side to be the most challenging. We often have people calling in saying the person I'd insured may have passed away or has now been diagnosed with a critical illness, so it can be tough to carry on with the rest of the day without feeling heavy. And then finally, how's your Christian faith relevant to it? Without the values of Christianity, I couldn't do the job I do. God often pops up in the conversations I have with my clients, and it's those clients I tend to have the strongest connection with. I find that my faith guides the advice I offer, and it resonates with my clients. Such a great sense of vocation in all of that, Shidden, and so wonderfully put and very eloquent. So thank you for that. But it's the point of all of this series is to try and find God in the day-to-day, in the normal, in the what we do between 9 and 5. It doesn't have to be work, because not everyone, I appreciate, is in paid work, but whatever it is on a day-to-day basis. And the things I found about this as I was reflecting on it as well, I've spoken to so many people over the years, and particularly Christians, who say, I don't want to do management. I just want to be in frontline care. And I understand that from some perspective. But there's a lot to be said for good management, because we've all seen bad management. And there's a tremendous amount to be said for doing it right and doing it well, and Christians being at the heart of that. So I'm going to try and wrap this up quickly now. Next slide. What about the fall? We've talked about creation, but some people might be saying, well, hold on a second, you know what happens in the next chapter? Does that undermine everything we've been talking about? Well, the fall seems to be the diminishment of this idea of shalom, this idea of these good relationships which generate life. And the fact that we can't then function properly as priests and kings as we're supposed to. So what happens? We hide from God. So we've got these three relationships: God, each other, the rest of creation. We hide from God as a result of the fall. They hide from each other. Rather than being naked and not ashamed, they make fig leaves to cover themselves and create separation between each other. Everything goes wrong with our relationship with creation as well, the third relationship. If you look in Genesis 9, it refers to the animals fleeing. They're scared of us now, and that wasn't the plan originally. And then Genesis 3, there's the curse after the fall. The ground doesn't cooperate with us anymore. It's just a lot harder to do things than it once was. But even despite all of that, God is still the creator, and he's still involved in blessing and caring for creation, and he's doing that through us. And he declared over and over again, this is good, this is good, this is good, this is good. The creation didn't become bad all of a sudden. Evil has found its way in, there's no doubt about that. But I don't think that stops our original vocation. We still see tremendous amounts of God in the world around us. And the Psalms are quite good on this, aren't they? And they were written long after the fall, but they keep declaring God's goodness. So Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Just talking about the glory and the majesty of creation. And yeah, God's working to redeem this world, to restore it. And we want to be part of that through all the stuff that we've just been talking about. And of course, the biblical prophets had a tremendous amount of confidence that God was going to do this and it was going to work. You know, I'm going to pour out my spirit on all flesh. Isaiah talks about this new world order that we can look forward to, which is very famous. Isaiah 11:6, the wolf will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf and the lion, the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. This idea of shalom, of those relationships being restored, and all the wonderful stuff that comes out of that. So we need to get right with God, we need to get right with each other, and then flowing out of that, getting right with our relationship with the greater created order. And as I was praying about this, I just felt if people are feeling jaded about their work or whatever it is they do day to day, to try and reconnect with this vocation that we've been talking about. Even the boring bits of what we do can feed very importantly into this vocation. And also thinking specifically about this idea of shalom. If you just bring up the final slide. Is there anywhere particularly that we need to see shalom, where there was shalom and it's been lost? We started by talking about the importance, in light of my flatmate's experience, of knowing what the story actually is, the true story, and where we fit within that story. And is this the story, that there was shalom, that shalom was lost, and now God is working to restore shalom, and he's working through us in each of those three relationships? So where do we fit into that? As priests and kings, restoring and maintaining right relationships. And which one of the relationships is the one particularly that you're thinking about today in terms of the absence of shalom? Your relationship with God, your relationship with others, your relationship with the created order, about what we're doing day to day, and thinking about how we can partner with God to redeem and restore. I'm going to hand back to Jeff at that moment.
Just invite the worship team come. During this time, just during this prayer and